Alright, this is the first of a series of video lectures I'm going to conduct about remix art and its importance in the history of artistic expression and language. This is going to be a long one, so you might want to sit down for a minute. I continuously get these comments on my videos about the fact that this remix culture that I've been talking about is not important, or it will never be successful, it will never be recognized. Give me a little bit of freedom to express this, but you are categorically and fully wrong, and here's why. The artistic expression that you are participating in has a very full and developed tradition and history. And let me first begin by saying, and I've referenced both of these guys before, I'm espousing two thinkers. One is Lawrence Lessig, and you guys have heard me talk about him till I'm blue in the face. His book Remix, which is extremely important, please read it. But I'm also going to get into this book, Here Comes Everybody, by Clay Shirky. Shirky is a little bit of an idealistic rube, but he's got some ideas that are important for you guys. Now, let me go ahead and break this down. In the history of artistic expression, especially in English, we have a pattern of locking down resources, of bottling up expression in some very tyrannical ways. And let's roll this back about 1,000 years, because Christianity has a very, very large role in this process, and here's why. In the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, you had a massive underclass of people. These people were not educated, they were not literate, they could not read. Well, they had a language, but they had no access to the cornerstone of their culture, the art that brought them all together. That was, of course, their religion, Christianity. The reason they were kept out of this is because at that point the Catholic Church had the Bible basically in Latin. And Latin was the bottleneck in this instance. And so the peasant class could never have an interpretive role in the religion or the culture because the church structure kept them out. Now, what changed this? Well, Protestantism had a role, but there were also other forces that undermined the authority of the Catholic Church long before Martin Luther nailed the 95 Theses to the door. And that was the rise of what we call the Vernacular. Now, you guys need to know a lot about the Vernacular because it has a lot to do with you. And here's all the Vernacular is. You started to have these artists and poets who, instead of writing in the traditional Latin language, the language of God, the language of religion, they began to write in common English. Now, this is so important. And one of the main people who began this process was Dante. And Dante wrote what was called the Divine Comedy. What you guys probably know very well is the Inferno, the Purgatorio, and the Paradiso. The big hubbub about this, and a lot of people considered this vulgar at the time, vulgar, remember that, was that he wrote this very divinely inspired piece, this epic poetry. He didn't do it in Latin. He wrote it in vernacular Italian. And for him to write in vernacular Italian was very, very controversial for his day. And you have these poets and you have these writers that finally begin to bring the language and the traditions of their religion into common, ordinary language. This gave rise to different translations of the Bible into vernacular language, into English. And if you look at the early history of the Bible, you have all these different versions of it because it's translated to different forms of English. Now, this opened it up, but it still required a great deal of education in order for you to break into this field, in order for you to interact with your culture. The next big shift in culture was, of course, the printing press. The printing press is a gigantic deal for the development of culture and for the spread of ideas. Because before, it was difficult for people to actually produce text because a whole bunch of monks had to sit in a room and hand write everything. But when this guy came along and invented the printing press, all of a sudden you could mass produce Bibles. You could mass produce stuff that people had written, little to no effort at all. And that's what Shirky talks about, is that as technology develops, you begin to see new artistic forms come about because more people have access to the culture, they have more access to the language, they have more access to publication. How do you guys fit into this? The same exact conflict has been playing out in the movie industry. Why? It's incredibly expensive to produce a movie. Even, let's roll this back to like the 1920s and 1930s. It was very difficult to actually put together what they called a moving picture at that time because you had to have such expensive equipment. And in order to distribute that film was also extremely difficult because the distribution of film was something that required mass production of material and it had to debut in large buildings, and basically the film medium was locked. It was not something that a common ordinary person could interact with in any capacity. It had to be very broadly financed. It had to have a lot of material provided to it. Now, technology has radically changed since the early days of film, and in the last 20 years, it's sped up even more. That what you're seeing now is that the debut of YouTube and these different software programs that you use to edit video is a lot like the printing press in the early in the early development of the printing press, in the fact that you can now produce video text and move it around and reshape it and turn it into something other than what it originally was. It's the same exact conflict, and it's happening all over again. And don't shortchange yourself, because at that time, people looked at vernacular language and vernacular poetry and vernacular writing as something vulgar, right? You guys do vulgar things, according to some people, but 50 years into the future, it might not be viewed that way at all. It might be one of those grand historical shifts. And the funny thing is that, again, I've gotten so many suggestions and feedback about, we have the music video, we have the fad genre, we have the more abstract genre. That's what happened to poetry when the printing press was invented and people were allowed to spread their ideas around. So in actuality, you guys want to be resistant to this. You want to say it's never going to matter that much. It does. This is actually the development of language, the development of expression, the development of culture as it's been playing out in the whole broad spectrum of human history. Stop resisting it, because we've seen this before and we've actually measured it. So please, pick up Shirky, pick up Lessig, because they talk about these things. And I'm going to say it one more time. You guys are probably participating in a cultural force that has now reached a point that you're going to lose control of it. And that it's going to develop in ways that you guys can't stop. I mean, you've literally caught something you can't control. That sounds a little crazy, but it's true. It's a historical force. We've seen this play out so many times. Now, if you want to argue with me, please do so. Please respond to the comments, because if you haven't noticed, I'm trying to respond to the ideas that you guys are bringing out with these video lectures. The next lecture is going to be based upon high modernist poetry and the way that you actually interact with that tradition. This time it was more about the physical medium. Next time we're going to do the artistic side of it. So that's it for this time. Thank you very much. Please debate.